Well, it's been a while. Um, where to begin? Where to begin? I think the first thing to sort of say is that I'm going to be launching a podcast, and you might consider this episode one. Now, we're going to be upgrading the podcast as time goes on, and we're going to be adding some bells and whistles, and there'll be sort of a number of things that sort of add to it. I'd like to hire a producer, so if you know of anybody who should be involved with this effort, if you know of anyone who should be engaged, I am going to have a sort of private Signal group chat that I do with friends and colleagues. So we're going to kind of keep it a bit more professional than I have in the past. And I'm going to be launching this maybe once, maybe twice a week as time goes on. They're, of course, going to be recorded, and we're going to upload them onto Chuck Stack or the Charles Johnson Thoughts and Adventures over on Substack. Now, you should understand that me posting live to X is very much a provocation, and the notion that the fact that I'm doing it effectively the day after on the anniversary, the second year anniversary of the alleged attacks of October 7th, that's not a coincidence. And I want to be sort of clear as to why I have decided on those dates. And we'll sort of get into that in a second. But one thing I want to kind of grasp first and foremost is that we're at a moment right now where we need sort of real leadership in the country, in politics, in business, in sort of many, many categories. And since I was sort of unceremoniously kicked off of this platform earlier this year, I've had some time to reflect on sort of what's been going on, how I can be a part of it, and I'll sort of have more ideas and more things coming out in the next few months, next few weeks and months. But the long and short of it is, you should expect to hear more from me and more about kind of the projects I'm working on. Since we last chatted, some of the things that I had said in these X chats were clipped and used in a rather large, rather expensive, lawsuit that I'm in with a guy named Hal Lambert, who is a front for Elon Musk and for Elon Musk's associates in Texas. And we'll kind of get into that more if people are curious about it. We're going to go about 2 hours today, maybe 3 hours, depending on if it really gets going. And we'll kind of reassess. I have a colleague here who's setting up some super chat stuff. I'm not sure if that's going to work. We're sort of playing around with that format, and I'm going to be likely hiring him in the next few weeks or so to come kind of work for me full time. So maybe he'll be sort of my Jamie equivalent if you're thinking the Joe Rogan side of things. Now, one thing you will not see me do, I'm not terribly interested in ad reads. I don't really think any of that stuff really works. I think it's kind of lame. And I'll just be posting sort of the audio files here, on my Substack, on Spotify, on a few other places as well. We'll maybe clean them up. We maybe will not. It's kind of unclear at the moment, but we're sort of just trying this as we go. I had thought earlier about doing a kind of show. I was looking very seriously at renting studio space in DC. I'm not sure yet if I want to do that. And there's sort of a lot of reasons for it. I'm not really interested in being on camera. I'm kind of more interested in people hearing my ideas, reading my ideas. That's sort of where I'm most comfortable. I don't really like the whole like get gussied up, put makeup on, wear suits. All of that sort of stuff is kind of not really my style. Um, and I'm sort of just not. I'm not going to do it unless I really have to. Maybe that'll change. Maybe if there's sort of some major response. But for now, I think I'm much more comfortable sitting at home, using the microphone I'm going to be, that's coming in the mail. So let's sort of like step back a bit and sort of get kind of going, and let's kind of really kind of tuck into what's been going on in the last basically since January, since Trump was reinstalled, I should say, as our president. Um, Obviously, I was not a supporter of Donald Trump in the 2024 campaign cycle. I leaked JD Vance's very pro Netanyahu text messages, which I'm very proud to have done. And I have become much more, shall we say, radicalized or much more skeptical of the Israelis, in the days since October 7th, and in 2023. And I think what we're going to discover as time goes on is that we have a sort of fifth column in the United States, and I've been writing about that fifth column, particularly in the conservative movement. I'm very pleased to see that Candace Owens has been weighing in. I don't really agree with a lot of Candace Owens' style. Let's just say she's not how I would present myself, but it sort of takes all kinds, and I think she was quite strategically clever in waiting as long as she did to release the evidence that I had known about for a while, that Charlie Kirk was a skeptic of the Israelis. And I've written about this in my Substack for those who are curious. It's free. You can kind of go about it that way. You're free to message me on this platform. I have somebody else checking it. I don't expect to be kind of tucking into the comments. I don't really expect to be tweeting all that much. In large measure, it's because I've been working on a novel. In fact, I sort of finished the first draft of one novel, and I'm on to the second one kind of right away. And I'm hoping to get maybe 3 novels out between now and the 2028 presidential cycle. I think they'll relate to each other in different ways. But yes, I think you'll be quite interested in the novel that I've sort of completed a draft of. And if any of you are interested, I'm happy to just message me your Signal account and maybe some details about you, and I'll be happy to send you kind of a copy if you agree to read it in that kind of close attention to detail. Let's sort of start. Let's sort of okay. We can maybe get into this more, later, but it is true. Like there are journalists who've been contacting me, and it is true that I am thinking seriously, or at least as seriously as one could think, about maybe running for political office in the near term. I'm not yet sure what form that will take, but I have been meeting with Democrats and with other kind of maybe the old heads, I guess you would say, within the Democratic Party, because I do think that the Democratic Party needs to be revamped. It needs to be sort of changed. The direction it's going in is clearly not working. And I think a lot of that has to do with this sort of issue of being an October 8th liberal. And what I mean by that. Now, for those of you who are a bit younger, the Gen Z crowd, you probably won't recall that there were plenty of sort of September 12th Republicans. That is to say that there were a number of people who had sort of been going about the 90s, living a kind of hedonistic lifestyle, living a kind of Hollywood lifestyle, sort of retreat from history, that whole Francis Fukuyama idea. They had sort of absented themselves from the world. And then, of course, like a thunderclap, 9/11 happens. Now, I've written about the kind of Mormon connection to 9/11. I've written about the drone connection to 9/11. It's my contention that the 9/11 attacks were the planes were kind of remotely hijacked. I know that's kind of a big thing to claim, and can maybe go into that, but I've never really believed the assessment of the 19 hijackers. And I don't necessarily go into the whole Israel did it thing, but I certainly think that there's a lot of evidence that the Israelis certainly knew about what was going on, in particular the kind of Bibi wing of the Israelis. And in the past, I've called for basically releasing, declassifying all of the material that the Israelis knew about 9/11, sort of ahead of schedule. Now, why am I an October 8th liberal? Well, there's sort of a lot of questions that I have about the 2024 cycle. I certainly think the United States on a whole has not really taken seriously a lot of the problems of Unit 8200 and the role of Israeli hacking technology in both targeting Americans and in targeting sort of others out there. We are, of course, all familiar with Pegasus now, but there hasn't really been a discussion about Pegasus or its equivalents being used in the United States. Nor has there been really any discussion about sort of what took place in Israel on the day of the 2024 election. And it seems to me pretty clear that there was a kind of putsch within Israel, and that there may have been an attempt at interfering in the American elections, certainly in the key swing areas. This is not to excuse Kamala Harris, who I did vote for, but who I think was a relatively weak candidate. And in fact, my criticism of the Biden administration on the whole is the sort of inability of Joe Biden, of the Democrats generally, to sort of push back on Israeli misbehavior. I've called for jailing Benjamin Netanyahu. I think if he were a brown or a black leader, he would be jailed. And I believe that the next president of the United States, barring something kind of crazy in the next 3 years, should act to arrest Netanyahu, should act to detain him. He should not be allowed to visit the United States. He should not be allowed to visit the White House, 4 times in 8 months. This is outrageous. And, I am aware that speaking ill of Netanyahu has led me to being targeted in different ways. I am aware of the sort of efforts that have been sort of done by the kind of fifth column billionaires and other players within our society. And I accept those risks. So, to be very candid about it, my view is that yes, this advocacy, these things I believe may well cost me my life, but it's something I'm okay with, to be blunt about it, because I think that there are bigger issues at play, and there are bigger things in store for those of us who actually start pushing back on the kind of Israeli matter. And for those who are kind of unaware of kind of the last 6-7 months on this, I guess 10 months now, my sort of view on it is that the flotilla provocation that took place and it continues to take place is a noble act, and I'll kind of go into kind of more of my thoughts on that if people are curious. I am talking with some people right now about going on the flotillas in the future. I'll have kind of more details in the future about that. I don't really want to telegraph all of my details on that, but I am intending to go probably with a documentary crew who wants to film a movie about me and about my work. And so I'll have kind of more detail in the near future. But I think it's important for Americans to be on those flotillas, for the Palestinian flag to be waving right alongside, the American flag, Old Glory. And I think it's especially important for those of us who come from military intelligence families to really make it clear that the United States of America, while we may be under a kind of Zionist, controlled government, we are in fact engaging in resistance to it. And I think the next president of the United States certainly should be focused on and indeed promoting and supporting a Palestinian state. I think that sort of goes without saying at this moment. And of course, our real closest allies, namely France, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, have all recognized the state of Palestine, which is, I think, a necessary precondition for really rolling back some of the issues here. Um, I should say this is not, I depart from my friend Nick Fuentes. I do agree that there are problems in the United States where we do have a number of Jews and a number of evangelicals who place the issue of Israel above loyalty to the United States. But I regard this really as a question of Zionism, and Zionism really being a supremacist ideology. The idea of there being, a God. This God has a chosen people. These chosen people have a claim to a specific plot of land. All of that I find extremely hard to believe, not terribly credible based upon the scientific evidence. And just as I don't really agree with my Mormon friends who say that the Garden of Eden was in Independence, Missouri, I'm not really there with my Israeli, friends out there, or sort of Israeli, interlocutors, I should say, who very much want to commit a genocide, who want to commit ethnic cleansing. And unlike others out there, I've met settlers, I've talked to them in the United States, I've been to Israel, and they're quite serious about the ethnic cleansing. And I think all the wishful thinking in the world, it's really kind of irresponsible at this stage. And we should be much more honest about the relationship of the Israeli state to the Nazis in the past. and we should be honest about the degree to which it's penetrated the United States. And I think that's sort of an essential point of departure. Now, um, I don't think that this will always be the case. I believe that there have been periods in American history where the United States has been more under the sway or under the influence of one country or another. And certainly, I think that there have always been sort of patriots who've stood up and actually opposed them in different ways. I mean, some of us who are in this chat are descendant from the very people who fought at Lexington and Concord, and so I think it's not a coincidence that the sort of Israeli war machine targets those of us who have that heritage, who have that family connection, and I think this also explains why they increase a lot of hostility to Black Americans. Namely, you see this in the targeting of people like Lisa Cook and some of the others, that have become a kind of target of the Trump administration. And certainly you see this with other populations as well. Now, I should say, part of the reason I'm doing this podcast is in large measure because, it's unfortunate, but it's true that I'm a writer in a country that doesn't like to read all that much. And that's a kind of depressing thought to think about. But it's also, why did Jesse James rob banks? That's where the people were, or excuse me, that's where the money is. And so I think the same thing is obviously true of going on these platforms. And if there are platforms I'm neglecting, or groups that I should be focused on, or outfits I should be going, or people I should be talking with, I'm certainly happy to engage in that way. Now, I have a list of kind of topics, things that people wanted me to kind of get into, and I can kind of get into them. I guess we'll just sort of go through them one by one. And if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the back channel. We'll get into that more, and then we can kind of go from there. And as I say, you can send me stuff on the Substack. You can send me stuff in the chat as well. And I'll be taking kind of questions probably in about 10, 15 minutes or so. People want to engage, and they don't mind being recorded, of course. And we can maybe get into sort of things I've written in the last year and change, because I've gotten a lot of people want to talk about the piece I wrote about Mormons recently and the connections with Elon Musk and with the Charlie Kirk death and all of that. And certainly we can go there if people are curious. But so what I should say is, so I was sued in October of last year by a guy named Hal Lambert. He was somebody I was in business with, and we had together committed to raising money for a satellite deal for a company called Umbra, which is a synthetic aperture radar satellite system. Now, I of course, sourced the deal. Mr. Lambert is a political operative. He doesn't really know all that much about science or technology. And I sourced this deal. I asked him to help me raise money for it because he had had experiences raising money from Republicans in general in Texas and elsewhere. He got involved with the kind of raising of money for the 2016 inaugural outfit for Donald Trump. And Lambert, has been on public, broadcasts, namely, I think CNN, Fox Business mostly, and he's the kind of political guy, trying to build a kind of reputation for himself as a tech guy. Now, Lambert and I, even though we agreed to raise the money together, even though we agreed to work together to split the carry, to split the investment, he proceeded to cheat me. I sued him, just making it clear that anything that happened I wasn't really responsible for after he sort of stole my interest in raising the capital. And he then went and got first Quinn Emanuel and later DLA Piper to sue me. Now, this was coincident to me talking both to the FBI and to other governments and government agencies around the world about Elon Musk. And Mr. Lambert is a business associate also of a group called GigaFund. GigaFund is controlled by a guy named Luke Nozick. Luke Nozick was one of the PayPal mafia, was a sort of early investor in SpaceX, and he's very much Elon's guy. And it's been said that GigaFund the fund that's backing the many of the investments that Lambert is in, that GigaFund is a kind of front for various foreign countries and also for Elon Musk. So I was sued in this case. Quinn Emanuel, the lawyer, is a guy named Will Thompson, and Quinn Emanuel is Elon Musk's personal law firm. Has worked with him quite closely. It was started by a guy named John Quinn. John Quinn is a Mormon. His father was a Mormon. He's certainly a Mormon by lineage. I don't know if he's still a practicing Mormon. I'm not aware. And what ended up happening is that the lawyer from Quinn Emanuel, Will Thompson, later went from there to DLA Piper. DLA Piper is, of course, the law firm that represents Tesla. So we have a guy kind of moving from Musk's personal law firm to his to Tesla, which of course is is a big part of what's going on. Now, I want to say a few things. One of the reasons, I would, I'm asking for people to kind of join in different ways in these efforts is I'd like to build a kind of large data set of people interested in the kind of issues that I'm interested in. Now, obviously, as I said before, I am thinking very seriously about running for office. I am very serious about having people help me run for office. And if you want to run to be, say, I don't know, president of the United States, you have to raise probably about $1 billion, $6,800 a pop. Now, I don't think that that's really possible, nor do I think it's totally desirable. And I think it's sort of shifting in different ways. I mean, Donald Trump very famously did a lot of earned media. I'm certainly not opposed to doing that myself. And I would say that the parallels of Trump, who was a Democrat who became a Republican, versus me, a Republican that became a Democrat, there's sort of lots of different ways in which Trump and I are similar. We've known each other for a very long time. We have sort of connections through New York and through other ways. I of course know Vance. People know that I know Vance. It's very public. I am opposed to Vance as president of the United States. I think he needs to be stopped, and I think he needs to be stopped relatively quickly. Of course, by nonviolent means, through the ballot box, uh, or through impeachment. But I think that he actually represents a far greater threat to our country and to its future than does Donald Trump. In short, Vance very much is the fascist that people imagine Trump to be. Trump has always struck me as too lazy, too interested in parties, too interested in basically golfing and watching TV to be a real sincere, ideologically committed fascist. I just don't. He doesn't have it in him, and he's not getting any younger. Now, when it comes to the lawsuit, and the thing that people should know about the lawsuit is that one of the things that was requested of me or demanded of me was discovery, and in particular, the discovery questions were prompted by this DLA Piper attorney. DLA Piper, of course, is one of the very few law firms that continues to operate in China. And in particular, they were asking me all these questions that were Musk related. We know that Musk has funded other lawsuits, sometimes sotto voce, sometimes kind of behind the scenes, targeting people who are critics of him, targeting people who have criticized him in a very loud way. And I have been told through friends and others that I have been, I am being targeted by Musk, and that there's a kind of effort to seize the assets that I own. And indeed, in the particulars of the case, I was sued in Texas, down in Fort Worth. I refused, on principle, to provide any of the material that was requested by the discovery process. They were asking me questions about any journalists that I had spoken to. They were asking me questions about pretty much everything Thiel related, Musk related, and they were constantly changing that which they were asking me. They were sort of constantly shifting um, what was being asked of me. And so they really had no interest in me actually complying. What they were interested in doing was harassing me and trying to bankrupt me. And while I've been successful in my life, not as successful as as Elon, obviously, the richest man in the world, or as some of his allies. And indeed, given that some of the investments I have, we are co-investors in various things. I have my own relationship with GigaFund and with other of these firms. They're effectively trying to steal my assets. That's sort of the game plan that's been going on. And it's I was found guilty because there was no trial put on, and it was really only at the punishment phase. And I was hit with what amounts to a $71 million judgment, which is rather incredible, rather laughable, um, rather amazing, to be honest. And when I was hit with the judgment, I immediately ran to the hotel where I'd been staying. You are not allowed to have your cell phones at federal court, particularly even if you're representing yourself, as I was in that matter. And I ran sort of home to the hotel room, opened it up, and found that it's Dominion Voting Systems, Donald Trump, and yours truly, who have the record for the largest one of these sort of settlements, or one of these attacks. And I've now brought the matter before the Fifth Circuit, which has agreed to take the case, and there it stands. I'm filling out all the paperwork, representing myself. Now, you might ask, Charles, why are you representing yourself? Well, there's sort of several reasons for it. One, I don't have infinite cash, just being blunt about it. And even when I have the cash, I would prefer spending it on those I care about, spending it on other things. And frankly, I think that there's something kind of American about pushing back against this sort of tech mafia, Texas tech mafia kind of Likud world. It's kind of very American to push back and do it myself. Um, I'm under no illusions as to whether or not it's going to be easy. Though, from what I understand, this judge in this case, Judge Pittman, has been one of the most overturned judges in history. So I'm pretty optimistic about kind of my chances. And as are a number of sort of lawyers that I've sort of spoken to, chatted with, kind of engaged with as well. The transcript in this case, in my case, is not available on Pacer until October 16th. And so we still have some time. But in that transcript, I got Hal Lambert and a number of other people on the stand to admit that Lambert was in fact acting as a sort of ally of Chinese and foreign investors in the United States. And I believe that I will come out of this whole experience being not only vindicated, but somewhat heroically vindicated. And I'm kind of optimistic and kind of excited about it as it plays out. Now, those could be very famous last words, but I'm feeling good. I'm feeling lucky, as it were. Now, I want to kind of, yeah, I want to be sort of clear, too, that the thing that's kind of interesting to me about that settlement, or that sort of $71 million judgment against me, is never went to trial. I was sort of found guilty as a kind of punishment, as kind of default judgment. It never went to trial. But what's interesting to me about it is, 71 is a very suspiciously biblical number. It's a kind of fascinating number in different ways, and so I'm very excited to have that happen. In the way that it has happened. And I should mention too, I'm also in a suit with Mr. Lambert over the Clearview AI matter. And I see that there's some people here who went and visited me when I was doing the Clearview AI situation. And Clearview AI, of course, was a company that I was involved in helping set up, but that kind of quickly fired me, quickly got rid of me, in part because I didn't want the facial recognition technology to be used on Palestinians. And I think history will vindicate me on that. And I'm sort of proud to have stood up against the Israel lobby and against its allies in the United States and sort of pushing back in that way. I should also mention, too, that a lot of people should understand that a lot of these tech companies, very much want to sell into the federal government, but they are barred from doing that because of the John McCain National Security Act of 2019, which effectively restricts Russian, Chinese, and other countries' technology from being brought into the American tech stack. And I think that this is very much a good thing. We should be encouraging that in different ways because I think ultimately it's going to be what brings down a lot of the fake tech companies. And we can kind of get into that if people are kind of curious about which companies I think are the fakest and why. And very much we can kind of get into the AI bubble matter as well. All right, let me see here. I've got a few other questions that were sort of sent in. Um, okay, so I want to discuss a little bit about David Adler, who is a progressive guy, and he was one of the Americans who was a part of the Gaza flotilla. For those who are kind of uninitiated, there were a number of people, I think 500 in total, some 40 ships or so, or thereabouts, that went in the Mediterranean to try to build a sea corridor for humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. And Gaza, has effectively been under siege for quite a number of years, even ahead of and beyond October 7th. And the sort of the IDF has been, shooting and killing people doing things like, going swimming, going and fishing, off the coast of Gaza. And the sort of Israeli interpretation is that Gaza, which has been a sort of concentration camp for a number of years, is now going to be effectively a death camp. And that was something that a mentor of mine, told Bill Clinton about in the 1990s, but we're very much in that moment right now. And so we all sort of ask ourselves, what would we do if there was an incident in the world in which people were being killed, people were being massacred, people were being harmed? What would we do? Would we stop another Holocaust? Would we stop various, what would we do, right? That's sort of the question we always sort of ask ourselves. And I think in the case of Gaza, we're sort of left with this question of what is our responsibility as Americans? Because obviously, as Americans, we equip the Israeli war machine. We allow the Israeli war machine through our politicians, through our money, through our consent in a lot of ways to be perpetrating, a sort of vicious aerial bombardment, a sort of vicious occupation of the Palestinian people. And how is that consistent with our sort of values as Americans? Is this idea that all men are created equal? How is the promise of the Declaration of Independence? How is that consistent with Zionism, which says that there are some special people that have a right to rule other people by virtue of a book written, however many thousand years ago, based on an interpretation of a book? Because I should say that there are quite a lot of Jews around the world who don't share this view, and indeed many of the Jews who've opposed the Netanyahu regime in different ways have been targeted through spurious accusations in the Me Too, era, as well as, in my view, Jeffrey Epstein was one of these people that was targeted in large measure because of his political affiliation with Ehud Barak, who it's my contention, contrary to Tucker Carlson, that Ehud Barak was the handlee, not the handler, that Epstein was really handling Jeffrey. Jeffrey was very much handling Ehud Barak. We can kind of get into my kind of contrarian takes about Jeffrey Epstein too, if people are curious. I've certainly written about it, thought a lot about it. It's in fact the subject of the novel that I've been sort of finishing and kind of completing is my relationship with Epstein. Told in a fictional sense, but as with all things fictional, there's sort of an element of truth to it. Let's see here. I want to just kind of get into a little bit more. Okay. So we're gonna do. So on the David Adler point, so Adler gave this sort of very impassioned discussion for The Nation. He's a Californian guy. He's a Jewish guy, but he has French, Australian, and American citizenship. And he elected to go to Israel as a part of this flotilla. He elected to go under his American citizenship, which I think speaks well of him. And of course, he and I think there was about 20 or so other people that went that were Americans, including some veterans as well. I think this is a very healthy development, and we should be encouraging it as time goes on. And this idea that, we are going to build a humanitarian corridor, that the pier, the ill-fated pier, the pier that was disrupted in a lot of ways by Israeli activity, that this pier was a kind of precedent for what needs to be a maritime corridor, into Israel or into Gaza, as a way of giving humanitarian aid, of feeding the Gazans so that they don't starve to death. I think this should be strongly encouraged, and anything I can do and others can do to sort of do that, I think we should be pushing in that direction. So while I don't necessarily agree with the politics of a lot of the people who are involved, I do think we should be encouraging it, and I do think that there should be a vessel that, in the very near future, that flies an American flag alongside the Palestinian flag, and makes clear that the American people are very much not with the Israeli war machine. I do think, though, we're entering a period in our history um, where we may have a more and more anti-democratic system, that the unitary executive theory that was pushed by a number of the neocons in the 1970s, it may be used to justify a kind of quasi-dictatorship. And that the Israeli war machine, knowing that it's not popular, knowing that it has all these problems, is actually going to be doing what it can to make the United States a less democratic country. I think they will be pushing up and promoting certain people, particularly those who are the elderly or the infirm or the compromised in different ways, as a way of kind of controlling this country. And I think we see that with the Republicans that are compromised on sexual peccadillos. We certainly saw that, in many respects with the Joe Biden presidency, where Biden effectively bent over for Netanyahu. And we certainly see that today with Donald Trump. And it's pretty clear to me that both Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are, in effect, agents of the Netanyahu government that just so happen to affiliate with our government as well. If anybody has any questions or wants to tuck in any of these things that I've said, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to take some questions now. If you're kind of more shy, there of course are ways of communicating this stuff in the chat. I do think. Well, let me just say, I think we're at the beginning of a very interesting moment in American history, in that a lot of the tech world. Oh, I see Joseph's here. All right, let me add Joseph real quick. I think a lot of the tech world is collapsing. And I think that the tech stuff that's actually real is going to get effectively requisitioned or taken over by the US government. And I think this is an extremely healthy development and one we should be encouraging and supporting. Go ahead, Joseph.
All right. Am I audible?
You are.
Okay.
Go ahead. By the way, if I don't know
Great. Yeah.
you,
So,
by the way, if there are people who are requesting to speak, if I don't know you for whatever reason, just mention in the, message me what you want to say, and I'll happily have you up. I'm having somebody else sort of field who gets added up and who doesn't.
so one thing that I've been interested in, and you brought this up a couple of times, both the dealings with Quinn Emanuel, dealings with DLA Piper, unique aspects to those firms, and then also unique aspects to specific lawyers, Will Thompson, Bernie Kleinman. Interesting guys for sure, but like how decisive of a role do these guys really play versus just being service providers at an interesting nexus? Like what's the like what is the primary concern with like these particular guys?
Yeah, I would say just in the case of Bernie Kleinman, I very much respect and like Bernie. Bernie's represented a lot of very, shall we say, colorful characters over the years. And I think he's represented some of the people involved with the 9/11 terrorist attacks, allegedly, it should be said. Although I think one of them was convicted, so I think we can say definitively. He's represented a lot of mobsters, organized crime figures, and of course, yours truly. Now, Mr. Kleinman no longer represents me. In large measure, I wanted to kind of control what was going on in New York a lot more, and so I had to let him go, which is unfortunate because I rather liked him in different ways, but we sort of had a disagreement about how to proceed further in the case. With respect to Mr. Thompson, I very much think he's just a service provider. He's one of these guys that has been, in my view, this is kind of my interpretation of the events. He was, a former Major League Baseball player. He, was an oil and gas attorney at Quinn Emanuel before he moved over. And I think there's some sort of deal being structured within Texas that I don't fully understand. The DLA Piper folks, it's a relatively small shop in Texas and in Dallas in particular. Now, of course, they're very excited that they got a $71 million judgment against me. But I think we're going to see as time goes on that that's going to very much narrow as things sort of proceed in the circuit.
So basically, what you're like intimating is that he has some sort of like personal interest in this to do with like some relationships in Texas.
I don't know that
in like the
I
tech
don't know
sphere.
what his personal motivations are. It's sort of beyond my kind of interest, to be honest about it. I'm kind of more interested in the relationships both of the judge. Judge Pittman recused himself in a lawsuit in which X sued Media Matters. And of course, I'm also interested in sort of Pittman being overturned a number of times. He's a Federalist Society judge. He was brought on by the Federalist Society. Now he might have changed his minds. He might have slipped by them. There's sort of lots of things going on there. As for the Quinn Emanuel DLA Piper question, I mean, it is a fact that Quinn Emanuel, Alex Spiro, was Elon's lawyer for a number of years. He was his sort of fixer in different ways. And of course, this question of the Quinn Emanuel law firm representing Elon personally, Will Thompson being an attorney there. There are of course a lot of questions here too of whether or not one should sue Thompson, because one of the things I brought up in the Texas case is that my family had retained DLA Piper before Thompson came over. And on a real estate matter, my sort of parents own some properties in California. And so this question of conflict of interest, of how that conflict of interest waiver was kind of violated, it certainly is going to be interesting to see if Thompson actually did do the conflict check that he claims to have done, and whether or not DLA Piper itself could get into trouble. And we've seen a number of these law firms, get into trouble with the federal government in different ways, ways in which the law firms are fronts of various billionaires, foreign governments, and whether or not they should have to register under FARA, whether or not they are required to clamp down on anti-money laundering laws, because a number of these foreign billionaires are connected to heads of state. So this question of them funding lawsuits and sort of using the legal system with dirty cash, these are kind of issues that I think are going to become more salient, not just in my case, but in other cases as well. I have been finishing the brief, which is due on November the 3rd. I'll probably have more to say on that in the near future. I have nothing against Mr. Thompson. I do believe he's behaving unethically in this case, trying to seize assets that belong to other family members of mine. I don't think that's permitted. And I've talked to other lawyers that it's not permitted as well. So we shall see what ends up happening with him. It could well be the case that he's also being played by other forces. He could just be the help, as it were. And so I think that that's going to be issues that are going to get probably addressed in a later lawsuit.
Okay, that's interesting because I guess I hadn't thought that that there was like a particular interest of DLA Piper, but I guess this is just kind of consistent with your overall conviction that basically these people have an issue with you, both some sort of like interpersonal
Yeah,
dealings, but more just like
there can be a lot of reasons for why DLA Piper elects to take the case. It could well be the case that Tesla is a very large customer of theirs. And given that Tesla's board is very much controlled by Elon, it could be that he intimated that it would be great if somebody dealt with this Charles Johnson problem. It could have been communicated through one of his lieutenants. One needn't have a kind of like, crazy elaborate conspiracy here. DLA Piper might have elected to do it as a way of placating and making Elon happy. There have been other examples where law firms, where Musk has threatened law firms that work for him and told them to do certain things, or he would withdraw as a client. So it could have been a kind of implicit, threat or a kind of quid pro quo kind of deal. It could be, a sort of situation where institutions change over time, and whereas when this lawsuit was being put together, it could be that the world was a very different place in sort of summer of 2024 versus fall of 2025. It could also be that we're entering a global recession and people are willing to compromise their ethics to get paid more money because obviously there's a lot of money that's been sort of spent on this case by the plaintiffs, and it's kind of incredible on the one hand that Lambert claims that he's been rendered a pauper or rendered super poor because of things that I've said about his personal conduct and his business conduct. On the one hand, he claims to have lost like 90% of his revenue, but on the other hand, he has the cash to pay for $1,000 an hour attorney. Obviously, there were other instances in the court, things like in the discovery, they were asking me for any connections that I had with any attorneys or people out there who had any opposition to Elon. They were asking me about connections I might have had to short sellers. I don't know any short sellers that have shorted Tesla. Not that I would, it's sort of not really my thing. For what it's worth, I've driven Teslas, and I've talked about the cars in the past having issues with safety, issues that are currently being litigated by the U.S. governments in different places, particularly the self-driving car fraud. And I've written about sort of Musk's relationships on my Twitter and sort of various criminal things that he and people around him have engaged in. So it seems to me it's a very clear effort to kind of shut me up, try to bankrupt me, whatever. It won't work. I mean, it's just sort of silly. And in many respects, I kind of feel bad for this effort because I think it requires a lot of energy, a lot of cash to sustain itself. And I think it's going to be much harder to kind of get that going as things go on. And so we're in a stage now where we are seated at the Fifth Circuit. I filed a lot of my material with the Fifth Circuit. We shall see what the actual response will be, and I think it's going to be rather interesting as time goes on to see what ultimately ends up happening. If I had to sort of bet on it, I'm perfectly happy to continue representing myself, filing things, suing over this matter, surfacing documents. It's sort of like that famous what is that? The Watchmen series. Like I'm not locked in here with them; they're locked in here with me. I don't regard this as a problem for me. I regard it as a matter of civic pride to be in a situation in which I'm being sued uh, by by people I think over time will be revealed to be criminal in their behavior. So that kind of gives you my flavor on it. Any other things, Joseph? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess like do you think that like any of the counterparties in these cases have acted criminally? You
Yes,
mentioned like
yes.
unethical behavior.
Yes, I
Yeah.
do. I do think I'm not sure about the attorney, but I do believe that Hal Lambert certainly has violated securities law, and I do believe. Now, I'm not an attorney, though I've been doing a pretty good job representing myself, if I may say so. But from what I understand of the legal matters around the John McCain National Security Act of 2019, Lambert has brought in money into the U.S. in tech deals that is foreign money, and he's tried to use that foreign money to get his companies access to the American tech stack, namely through Clearview AI. And from what I understand, that's illegal. It can't be done. So I think there's going to be sort of issues there over the next bit. But yes, it's. I think it remains to be seen. It's very much a live issue, and I'm kind of more interested in the role of billionaires and Champerty and sort of billionaires backing people to sue other people. It was certainly an issue in the Gawker case, which I was a litigant on that. Or, I think it's going to be this larger question of the way in which billionaires, um, quietly fund lawsuits. And given that many billionaires are funded by foreign countries, there's sort of interesting questions here around money laundering, anti-money laundering laws that I think need to be sort of taken seriously. The sort of question of Champerty, of back in the day, back in the British world, there were nobles that would fund people suing other nobles, sort of proxies. I think that's going to be a very interesting question of how much that's going to be allowed in the future. So yeah, very good questions. Let's go to Anglo. Go ahead, Anglo.
Yeah, I know you just said this in the super chat, but I did want to get a little taste of your extended thoughts on Larry Ellison and the role that you think that he has in supporting the. I don't want to say something corny like the Patriots, but you see him as being on the pro-American side and not as much as the pro-Israel side. I'm a little confused.
Yes, thank you for asking the question. So there's sort of this like larger thing that's looming, right? And I've called it the cloud wars elsewhere. I've talked about this quite a bit, where if you look at AWS and you look at the U.S. government on the whole, it's a lot of the U.S. government spend is IT. It's cloud infrastructure. It's cloud. It's basically like all of our data is going up into into these databases around the country and increasingly around the world, and everybody's data from every country is really going into these data clouds. And so we have this problem where for a long time AWS was so far ahead that they could effectively charge the government whatever price they wanted us to spend. And that was a kind of real kind of problem. They were sort of gouging the taxpayer. This is sort of how it's been explained to me. And so there are other, systems now being set up. There's the Azure, cloud system with Microsoft. There's Oracle. There's sort of a number of cloud providers. And Ellison happens to control, to a large extent, happens to control Oracle. Now, I've read a lot about Oracle over the years. I've met a number of people who've worked at Oracle. Many of them are, we might call them like very pro-Israel. Like we might say that. But Ellison himself is a kind of more complicated figure in that he's sort of skeptical of a lot of Israeli excesses and sort of a lot of religious excesses. And he likes to keep his access. He's sort of traveled all around the world. He has relationships with all these different foreign leaders. And in particular, my interpretation of his role in the Bibi trials was that he was actually helping the US government in a lot of ways to kind of expose Bibi and expose some of the bribe paying stuff going on around Netanyahu. Certainly, I think when Netanyahu came to visit Larry Ellison at the island he owns in Lanai, I think that was a very interesting kind of development. I do think we have to sort of keep in mind that Ellison is 81 years old, which is it's older than the state of Israel, right? So we should be sort of mindful in that way. And I think I'm going to answer that question in a second. Thank you, Mr. Producer, for sending that to me. So what I would say about, let me think about how I would best put this. Ellison, all right, many of these companies aren't really guys. They aren't really people. They're kind of groups of people, and they're kind of organizations within a group. So a way that I've seen a lot of Israel spending in the past, at least when it comes to IT infrastructure, is it's in effect the US government is controlling a lot of the IP. It's in effect controlling a lot of the conversation. And so my interpretation of Larry Ellison is Ellison, first of all, I don't think that Larry Ellison and his son David Ellison have the same interests. I think Larry Ellison is spending lots of money through his son, through his sort of heir apparent. But this son, he has not always been super close to him. That really kind of developed later in David Ellison's life. And I think in some respects, what's happening is a lot of the money that the Oracle money is being used to kind of prop up the free press, prop up, the CBS Newses of the world. I think in many respects, this is a kind of healthier development because people are seeing, oh, Barry Weiss is running this. Oh, they're getting more of a flavor of what's really been going on. So, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see as it shakes out.
And just to understand, you were suggesting that Larry might be actually sabotaging his son deliberately.
It is a possibility I think we should take seriously, yes. Or he may be sacrificing his son in the sense that he may be putting his son in a position where he can't really win. Many people show up in Hollywood. Many people have these sort of great dreams and aspirations of what will happen in Hollywood, but it doesn't always work out that way, right? It's a sort of place where dreams go to die. And unlike in, say, Silicon Valley, where you can build an app, you can continue to get paid. That's not really the case with a lot of movie production or TV show production. And so, yeah, I think we're going to sort of see as time goes on. Hold on a sec. I got my first ever super chat. So, all right. I didn't even know what super chats were. Thank you, Mr. Producer. Let me read this. What does it say? It says, Hanania posted and then deleted something about Bernie Kleinman demanding money from you. What happened? Kleinman, who represented terrorists, seems off-brand for you and a doofus. Why did you hire him? Live and learn, I guess. Well, part of the reason I hired Kleinman was that there had been an effort by Ron Giller, who was the attorney representing Clearview AI, a guy who's very pro-Israel, a guy who built the control file or the opposition research file for Rudy Giuliani. And I hired him in large part to have a Jewish guy there as a kind of cover, this being New York. It was a sort of game that I was playing intra-Jewish world. Kleinman became kind of less necessary when I withdrew my lawsuit against Clearview AI. Frankly, I had no real business suing the company for $20 million. I was hoping to just get something out of the operation. And Kleinman came in later after I had Alston Bird and after I had others representing me. Alston Bird is a kind of British law firm. And I was sort of very interested in being represented by them. And of course, they got access to a lot of my data, which I think was a good thing. There's sort of a question about the relationship of Alston Bird and the British intelligence services. So one could maybe think that maybe I was wanting certain intelligence services to see certain things. Kleinman was demanding a bunch of money from me. I don't think he really deserved it. It was like 20 grand or something to that effect. And I told him that he would be paid eventually, but he was behaving in a very crude and nasty manner to me, really disrespectful. So I said, I'm just going to take a back seat here. And Hanania was asking me about him. I shared some of the messages. And I said, Richard, this is sort of not really finished yet. We're sort of in media res, and I'm happy to give you an interview or chat with you at length about the whole Clearview and Umbra stuff when it's all settled. But I would prefer at this stage kind of not to go there. I do think there's a strategy sometimes of hiring attorneys that where you want to see how they think about a problem, not necessarily because you think they're the best attorneys for you. And I also thought it would be kind of funny to be represented by the guy who represented some of the 9/11 hijackers or hijacker adjacent players. And I think sometimes you should try to do things that are funny or entertaining or make people think. Doesn't always work out, but that was sort of my thinking at the time. It's a good question. Go ahead, big. I'm not going to read that.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you for having me up here.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So you mentioned these tech deals, investors. I want to know what you think about right now, especially, one of their main backers. What's going on with this, this beehive cult in Utah. We all can understand that political violence is, escalating. Do you think we're going to have some sort of
Yeah, so you're asking
Mormon wars in the future
about the
again?
Mormon question, right? I mean, that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. I've written a lot about Mormons, okay, who I find to be one of the more fascinating religious groups out there. It is, in fact, my sort of relationship with the Mormon Church and my family's relationship kind of more directly with the Mormon Church as sort of people who've been persecuted by them. That's sort of the subject of my second novel. And I think what we are watching in general right now is the kind of unraveling of the Mormon Church or the sort of mutation of the Mormon Church. I think would be a better way of framing it. Now, we do see a number of alliances that exist between a sort of crazed element of the Mormon population and the Israeli state. We do have this larger question of to what degree were people selected for by the early church fathers because they were suggestible, because they were the types of people who could be persuaded to do crazy things highly effectively. And where does that really come from, this kind of cult-like thinking? Can you kind of breed people into a cult-like atmosphere or cult-like environment? I happen to think you can. And I can kind of go into kind of why I believe that in different ways. But what we in effect have is we have by some accounts, 300 billion. By other accounts, it may be as large as $1 trillion, a kind of secret sovereign wealth fund within the United States that owns a lot of land, owns a lot of technology, owns basically a lot of stuff because, as you may well know, members of the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints, as they prefer to be called, donate about 1/10 of their money to the church, at least 1/10 of their money to the church. My view, just generally, is that the Mormon Church, as I've said, is unraveling, and that as it unravels, it actually can be probably more dangerous. Because what tends to happen when people leave the Mormon faith is that they tend to be radicalized in other directions. It's sort of like, when people leave cults and grew up in a cult, they don't necessarily become like super rationalist, normal people after they leave the cult. They can sometimes be radicalized to believe even crazier things. And I think this we live in kind of an era of cults. And I think that that's something that those of us who've lived in the western part of the country kind of know well. To a certain extent, Hollywood is a cult. To a certain extent, Silicon Valley is a cult. And certainly elements of Utah are a cult. I've written about this elsewhere, that kind of Mitt Romney and other players were kind of tamping down some of the crazier cult elements of Mormonism. And I think that this was a good thing. Unfortunately, a lot of the seven habits of highly successful people Mormons, like the John Huntsmans of the world, they built relationships with other countries, namely Russia and China. And this sort of relationship that a lot of the Mormon church has, it has a sort of its own foreign policy, if you will. And I think this can be extremely dangerous as well, because I think people think that the Mormon church is synonymous with the CIA, or it's synonymous with certain aspects of the American deep state. And while that's true in some cases, on the whole, I think it's becoming less and less true. Certainly, the guy who helped Snowden in the Snowden situation at the NSA contractor, he was a Mormon. And there's this sort of kind of Mormon hierarchy of sort of taking orders, doing things very effectively. I've run into them a lot in the classical music world. For those who are kind of curious, there's a lot of Mormon coders that I've met. They tend to be highly intelligent, highly repressed. I've sort of seen them as kind of white Asians, if you will, in a lot of ways. And there's sort of this other kind of element there of Mormonism where there's a lot of dishonesty to get temple recommends, where they will lie to one another, and they sort of become very effective liars. My own dealings with them, there was a group of Mormons within the FBI, and they were very obsessed with me. And partly it's because of my own family heritage. One of my ancestors was Lyman Johnson. Lyman Johnson was one of the first Mormons to leave the church. He was a member of the Quorum of the 12, which is probably beyond the interests of most people here. But in effect, my family took in Joseph Smith in Hiram, Ohio, and they took him in because it was thought that he could cure an ancestor of mine of rheumatoid arthritis. Shocker, he could not. And so he wrote Doctrines and Covenants, or Doctrines and Covenants was written on my family farm in Ohio back in the day. And so there are a number of Mormons, particularly Mormon radicals, which is a strange sentence to say, but it's a phrase to say, but there are a number of Mormon radicals that believe my family owes the Mormon church a tithe, or should be supportive of the Mormon church. And I know that there's a number of Mormons over the years that have tried to get me to rejoin the church. I was never raised. I was raised as an Anglican. I was a Catholic for a hot minute when I was married, or sort of in the process of becoming Catholic. But I go to Anglican Mass. But yes, there have been a lot of Mormons that have approached me over the years, and a lot of ex-Mormons in particular, and they like a lot of my writings on Mormonism. And there are a number of kind of Mormons out there that I am quite friendly with, ex-Mormons as well as current Mormons. And uh, I think this problem that we're having with the Mormon Church, obviously we saw, Charlie Kirk was sort of viciously killed by an ex-Mormon. What would the world have looked like had Charlie Kirk's assassin, had his parents been basically okay with him being a homosexual, right? What would that world have looked like? What if his parents were like, yeah, we don't really care that you're gay, Tyler Robinson, we love you anyway? The kind of normal approach that most moderate, normal Americans take. What if they just accepted and loved their son? Would he have gone and killed Charlie Kirk? I think that's a very serious question. And then we should also sort of think about the way in which Mormons are, they're like a lot of cult members, not all, but they can be kind of subject to both blackmail and, of course, also to kind of mind control, brainwashing, that sort of thing. And we need to be sort of taking that a lot more seriously than we do from a national security perspective. And similarly, this shooter, and I'm obviously not countenancing violence. I sort of very much oppose violence in a lot of ways. But if you are trying to cause a religious war between the evangelicals and the Mormons, which you could very readily identify crazy people in both communities and get them to attack one another. And that would, I think, occasion a lot of potential civil war activity in the United States. And that in turn would get America's focus away from the Middle East, away from Russia, Ukraine, and have us sort of descend into a kind of civil war. And I think that's a very real possibility. And particularly when you read, Chinese thinkers like Wang Huning, or you sort of study various people who've studied how to destroy the United States, this question of how do you trigger a civil war in the U.S., I think that these are very much live questions. And I should say, not all Mormons, right? But there are a lot of problems with elements of the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints and the modern world. And in some respects, our country owes its existence to Mormons because Mormons were highly useful for things like winning the Cold War, very useful for building the railroads. Television was developed by a Mormon. I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing or whatever, but there's some very interesting substacks on this point. High from Kolob is a very good one. There's a lot of Mormon science fiction. It's certainly a world that I know very well. And when I was a child, my uncle had warned me about our family's relationship with the Mormon Church, and I dismissed him as kind of crazy at the time. Like, really, there's something 200 years ago that like animates a certain group of fundamentalist Mormons? And he's like, yeah, actually there is. Like, this is a real thing, and like they do kidnap people, and you should be aware of this. And I dismissed it at the time as kind of a nutty kind of thing. But I have encountered it in different ways over the years, and I have battled with various Mormons, in the legal settings. I've battled with them in the philosophical settings, and in the case of, there's this great movie, or I wouldn't say it's a great movie, but there's a movie called Sound of Freedom. I don't know if you are familiar with it. If you are, like, give me a thumbs up or whatever. But there's this movie, Sound of Freedom, which is about, it's a sort of story about Tim Ballard. Tim Ballard was a kind of excommunicated Mormon, and he was a part of a unit led by a guy named Russell Nelson, M. Russell Nelson. I don't know if you were familiar with it, but he's a former head of the Mormon Church. And there are sort of other Mormon groups that are trying to convert evangelical Christians as a part of kind of changing the Mormon Church. And there's an idea of infiltrating churches. And I've written about that and sort of talked about that. People can kind of see my Substack going into it. There's this sort of idea that I've been sort of dealing with called Mormonism by lineage, Mormonism by habit. If somebody is acting Mormon, they're behaving in Mormonish ways, aren't they kind of an ally of the Mormon Church, right? If you don't drink caffeine, you don't drink alcohol, and you have your sort of like harem and this sort of question around polygamy, is very much a live question still in the world, and it's something that we need to take much more seriously than we do, particularly as the so-called richest man in the world, Elon Musk, his right-hand man is a Mormon, Jared Burchell. There's a sort of relationship with Elon and the Mormon Church at SpaceX, at Tesla, that really needs to be sort of considered and taken seriously. I am not of the view, I don't sort of take Mormonism on theologically. I do appreciate people who do. I'm an Anglican. I go to Anglican church about once or twice a month. I was raised Anglican. I go to the National Cathedral for a service, or various other places in and around Northern Virginia. So I'm not your guy if you're looking for like doctrinal fights over Mormonism. I don't think it's a Trinitarian religion. I know people may dispute that, but I don't really regard it as a form of Christianity. And it didn't, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others didn't regard it that way as well. I've written a lot about this. People are interested. They can read a book called American Zion, which I highly recommend. And yeah, there's sort of a lot of work to be done there. And I do think we should take seriously the fact that historically, the Mormon Church for many years lied about getting rid of polygamy. It very much allowed polygamy to continue. And so there's this larger question about to what extent are the fundamentalist Mormons correct on a doctrinal level, and the sort of more moderate Mormons, are they kind of like not actually correct? And then, of course, there's this other question of the Danites, which are, were a group of people that were basically killers for the Mormon Church, who would go and enforce things like when people needed to pay tithes, or who would kill people that the church didn't like, heretics, apostates, that kind of group. And there's this question of how much are they still around now? Are there, you look at a lot of missing person reports from the Mormon corridor. There's a lot of strange, unexplained deaths in those areas. And to what extent is that, historically, was that church leadership ordering it in the form of Brigham Young? Or to what extent is it sort of these splinter groups that sort of allow it? And that's a sort of larger question. I find the Mormon stuff very interesting. I'm very grateful that we didn't end up having a Mormon president. There's a lot of evidence pointing in the direction that J.D. Vance has sort of family connections to the Mormon Church as well. And I think it's this kind of cultish kind of thing is kind of dangerous for our republic. But yeah, it's a great question. Any other follow-ups, Big White? I know you probably read some of the things I've said about it. I feel like I've seen you before in some of these things, but maybe not.
I've been reading your Substack for like a year. I greatly appreciate the answer. This is a new account, by the way.
All right, let's just keep it at that. So yes, if anyone else wants to come up and speak, you're welcome to. I'll probably do this for another 35 minutes to an hour or so. There's some people who are kind of curious about, let's see, there were some sort of questions earlier about, in the private chats. Hold on one sec. Mr. Producer, do we have any other messages that have come in? So I did a piece recently about Matt Tiermans and sort of this question about what should be done with Beebe's fifth column in the United States. And people are curious about that. I can kind of go into that into more detail. I'll post it up in the Jumbotron for those who have not been familiar with it. And then here's the Mormon piece that I did. This is the Mormon one I did on Musk. Let's see if I have that floating around still. Just one second. Yeah, I think in general, what I would say about the Mormons that needs to be taken seriously is I do think there's something about American life that encourages people to join cults. And I think we need to sort of take that as a threat very seriously, because cults can be extremely effective at sort of disrupting everything. Um, and I think particularly the way in which cults intersect with other governments who support them, through money, through investments. That's sort of something we need to take very, very, very seriously, and I think something that is not really on the radar of most people. In particular, there's the Moonies, which the relationship that they have with the Russians historically, and with the Chinese and other players. But yes, there's a lot of these evangelical groups that are in effect fronts for Israel, and sort of the Netanyahu version of the Israelis. So yeah, we need to be sort of aware of what's going on in these churches. And in my view, we should be tracking a lot more of the money that's spent in these churches and in and around them. So yeah, it's very much a live question. On the chairman question, I was given a number of I was given basically a number of videotapes of Matt Tierman's deposition. Now, for those who are unaware, Tierman is sort of the guy who's been fingered as the former best friend of James O'Keefe. Was supposed to be best man at his wedding. There was a sort of closeness there, a fondness there, and that closeness and that fondness has now gone away entirely. Now that James O'Keefe is very much in a kind of fight over the future of the organization that he had founded, Project Veritas, and has gone and formed his own organization, OMG. I guess O'Keefe Media Group is what it stands for. I've known James a very long time. We were introduced in 2009, believe it or not, by none other than Andrew Breitbart. And James and I have been, we've been sort of friendly. We were closer friends when I was sort of more right wing. And I'm not really a big fan of surreptitiously recording people. It's not really my style. I understand why it's necessary for journalistic purposes, but I don't really think that when somebody goes on a date with another person, people lie all the time on dates, right? I mean, that's sort of like the point of it is to blow yourself up and to try to get laid and try to get, whatever. It's not really a kind of place where it should be seen as anything you say on a date is under oath. And I don't really want to live in a world in which people are not free to express themselves freely and maybe bombastically. I just don't really go for that sort of thing. Maybe I did when I was younger, but I don't really, a lot of the O'Keefe targets I'm not really the biggest fan of. I liked his earlier stuff on voter ID. I was into that. I thought that was relevant and interesting, but maybe because it was partially my idea. But yeah, I'm just not there with him on a lot of his techniques. And just like what I used to say to Charlie Kirk, that you can't be that old guy beating up on college students. I do think that some of these techniques and tactics, as the world changes, they become less useful. As Saul Alinsky once said, a tactic that drags on too much becomes a drag. And I don't really go for the surreptitious recordings. I do, however, go for court filings and go for depositions and go for all the things that are interesting in those court filings and depositions. And the videos, Mr. Producer, if we could maybe put some of those up in the Jumbotron. I think I tweeted about them. I think maybe retweet them or put them up in the Jumbotron so people can see them for themselves. And of course, there's lots of audio that is on the post in question. Look, I think that what happens in the conservative right, and to some extent on the liberal left, is that there are these people that are set up and created by the pro-Israel world, and they are sort of golems of a sort. They are sort of built up in a way, and if they ever get out of line, they're immediately destroyed, and the organization replaces them very quickly. And I think this is why the Candace text messages were so interesting. It's because they revealed what I had said and others had said, that Charlie Kirk was moving away from the Israeli world. And of course, I think that there should be a proper investigation done of the Charlie Kirk matter, just like I think there should be a proper investigation done of the James O'Keefe situation. Now, what I think really happened in the case of the James O'Keefe setup is the same as what Arthur Bloom says. I believe that O'Keefe was used by elements within the Israeli world to get out the Hunter Biden, the Ashley Biden diary, and that the purpose of O'Keefe's organization, which had gotten lots of donations from various pro-Israel, pro-Zionist donors, that it was a kind of cutout. It was a kind of place where you could launder information. Now, I happen to know a thing or two about this kind of thing because back in the day, I used to run a website called Got News, and we would also get tips from people that were connected, rather obviously after the fact, it became clear, from the Israeli world. And in fact, that audio that I released of John McCain betraying his country, which was in the Library of Congress, of him sort of doing the songbird, singing like a canary, that was something that was given to me by a guy that I later learned was connected with the Israeli state. And there's a lot of that kind of thing. Certainly, I experienced a lot of it when I worked at the Daily Caller, and I experienced a lot of it when I worked at Breitbart. There's a kind of laundering of intelligence masquerading as opposition research, and this laundering of all of that is used to affect our political discourse. And so I think that what ended up happening is O'Keefe got raided by the FBI over this Ashley Biden situation. The government has to take seriously efforts to go after the children of presidential candidates or presidential figures. And that, you can see this with kind of the Israeli obsession with Hunter Biden's cock. You can kind of see this in different ways where they look for the story of a politician. Apparently, speak of the Israelis, and your space will get shut down. Where were we? I believe we were discussing the role of the Israelis in sort of pushing people in different ways, and sort of my view that O'Keefe was, in fact, a target, a sort of scapegoat of what was going on in the Israeli world, and that Matt Tierman's working very closely with a pro-Zionist billionaire, Bob Shillman, was sort of responsible for O'Keefe's organization imploding. And if you look at sort of how does Matt Tierman make money? His involvements in foreign countries, his sort of investments that never really go anywhere. There's the sort of like larger question around Tierman is he an actor of a foreign intelligence service? And this is, of course, was raised in the deposition. And I think it's sort of something we need to be sort of thinking through is to what extent to what extent are a lot of players in the conservative ecosystem and in the podcasting space, to what extent are they foreign players, and to what extent are they backed by billionaires that are foreign players? And I think that the answer is quite a lot of them. I've talked about Rebecca Mercer elsewhere, and her family connections with Russia and with this sort of Netanyahu Israelis. And yeah, we have this question here of the way in which the political discourse in the United States is shaped by foreigners and by foreign players. And I think it's an extremely disturbing development, and one that we need to sort of take seriously as time goes on. Does anyone else want to come up and ask a question or engage? Happy to sort of, I see that we've got a few friends in here that I've seen before. And happy to, just so you're aware, for those who are joining the space, it's a continuation from earlier. We did a space for about an hour and a half, going into sort of my evolution politically, what I've been doing since I was kicked off this platform late last year. I think I have the distinction of being somebody who's been kicked off under all of the managements. I think Dick Costello kicked me off. I think the Indian guy kicked me off. And I think also the and the sort of Israelis around Musk kicked me off. So I've been kind of impressed with my ability to get kicked off, and I suspect I'll get kicked off here as well at some point. But we're recording it. We're going to be putting it on various platforms. I'm hiring a producer to help me on some of this stuff. And yeah, I think things are moving in the right direction. You're free to ask me about anything I've written about or sort of any general questions that you might have. We have a super chat going for people who are curious about certain topics. Mr. Producer, would you put that in our under the in the Jumbotron for people who are curious, want to ask questions? You're of course encouraged to read some of my stuff on Substack. I'll be linking to some of that, but you can kind of see that up in my profile. In general, I'm sort of on the personal side of things. I'm writing a novel now, which I'm mostly complete with, which is about my political evolution changes that I've had. If people are curious about that, I want to read that ahead of schedule. Feel free to message me your signal thing, and you have to sort of commit that you're going to read it and give me your notes on it. And I've been sort of editing that, working on that. I'm working on a sort of another novel at the same time, which is about genomic technology and Mormonism, which is a bit more science fiction-y, a bit more out there, if you will. But yeah, in general, I would say that I've been enjoying the degree to which I've been vindicated by events, and I've been enjoying the degree to which people on the right and the left are coming to the positions that I had for quite a while about Israeli misbehavior and misconduct. And I came to the conclusion in the first Trump administration that I had not supported the Jared Kushner presidency. I was not interested in the Jared Kushner presidency. And I was not a fan of Jared Kushner as president. And so I opposed Trump's reelection in 2020. Unbeknownst to me, we ended up getting a kind of Amos Hochstein presidency, kind of Tony Blinken presidency. And so I think in many respects, the sort of problems that we're facing exist kind of irrespective of the political parties. So I would admit that I think the Israeli compromise is a bit more intense on the Republican side than on the Democrat side. Anywho, if anyone wants to ask a question or come up and speak, I'm sort of happy to sort of engage. I see some people I've known for a bit here. Some of them are in my Signal chat. But yeah, I think what I would say just generally when it comes to um, the moment that we're in, we're sort of watching a kind of collapse of a lot of different institutions all at once, and this sort of effort by various outfits to sort of seize control of the narrative, seize control of the moment that we're in. And in the case of Trump, I don't believe that Trump really learned his lessons from his first presidency. And I think in many respects, what we've gotten instead of a Jared Kushner presidency is the Steve Miller presidency. And I think the wheels are coming off a lot more aggressively. I'm not a big fan of illegal immigration. I think it creates a lot of problems, not least of which, in our schools, in our plumbing infrastructure, in many respects in our society. But this idea of sort of, cruelly, arresting people while they're going to their kids' high school graduations, this is sort of not the approach that we should be taking. And we should also be sort of examining in a more serious way the way in which in the Biden presidency, the way in which a lot of Likudniks were actually helping to smuggle immigrants into this country, namely in Chicago and New York, and basically using that as a way of boosting the real estate prices in those areas. And I think, one thing we should be thinking about, there was a piece in the LA Times the other day about, how there's effectively no new apartments being built in LA, is, and this in the context of right after there was this major fire where apparently they arrested the fellow today. We can go into him in a second if people are curious. I have some thoughts there. But it seems to me that there's this kind of effort on the part of the left to just talk about this abundance agenda, that we should just be building housing, and saying, no. We should be cracking down on criminals who wash money and who illegally bring people into this country, and who don't follow our laws and basically get rewarded financially for that. And we should be doing our utmost to stop them. But I don't think we should have the theater that we've been having with Donald Trump and, targeting the migrants, but not the people who are employing them, not the people who are profiting off of it. This is sort of just not the approach. First of all, I don't think it will work. But second of all, I think it's kind of casual cruelty that doesn't really bode well. It may have a deterrent effect, but then again, the U.S. economy not doing well is probably having the more deterrent effect. For the same reason that lots of migrants didn't come during COVID, I think we're starting to see lots of migrants realize that the opportunities in the United States are not as present as they might have thought. And I think we should do a much better job of cracking down on all the human smuggling that's been going on, mostly in red states, I might add, mostly in Florida, mostly in California, actually mostly in Texas. Some of it's happening in California, though. Yeah, my understanding is that even in California, the migration is a lot lower. If you guys want, we can kind of go into this fire that took place. It was a kind of attack, this sort of Christmas Eve, it's a kind of interesting period. And somebody sent me that Patrick Byrne had defaulted ahead of the judgment. He defaulted ahead of the Hunter Biden situation. I like Patrick. I know Patrick a little bit. He's always been pretty friendly with me. Patrick has had a lot of strange things happen to him over the years, particularly in Utah. And he was one of the guys who'd kind of advised me on a lot of like strange Mormon stuff, strange Mormon activity. And so some people are sending me some stuff around that. But yeah, I think for me, what's interesting about the sort of like wild fire situation is the guy who did it. Let me pull up his name real quick. So he had lived in France, but he was like an Uber driver in California. He was sort of raised in France. So there's this sort of like question, French immigration to the United States has always been historically low. I think there's something like 200,000 Frenchmen in the U.S. So, and yet he has a German surname. So quite curious. And, the song that he was listening to, the sort of despairing, song is an extremely kind of disturbing, French kind of rap song. And then, of course, he's going on ChatGPT and imagining like burning everything down and destroying everything. Um, First of all, it's like really disturbing that we didn't really know much about this we didn't really know much about this suspect for, I guess, 9-10 months. I mean, the fires took place back in January. So, and yeah. So I'm seeing here, somebody sent this to me. Yeah, he is a French-born. So this is in the New York Post. So think of that what it's worth. But French-born Jonathan Rinde Knecht, which literally means in German, by the way, means cow servant, cow hand. So here he is, like basically being a servant of somebody. Went to YouTube to listen to the French song Seide Unte just before the blaze was captured. Yeah, so he's just basically talking about all this crazy French rap stuff. This is so the lines from the song. Daily life is killing me. I feel like I'm nowhere and too much bitterness in my head. I think about the mistakes we made. And they have sort of the art that he had made by ChatGPT, and he requested a quote dystopian painting divided into distinct parts that blend together seamlessly. On the far left, there is a burning forest. Next to it, a crowd of people is running from the fire, leading to the middle. So this is a kind of shocking story. I have my doubts as to whether or not this guy did this of his own volition. My view, just generally for what it's worth, is that there are a number of people out there that get kind of radicalized, get kind of driven in these ways. Online, I certainly think there should be a more robust investigation into all the people that Tyler Robinson was talking to. And, what we saw in the case of the guy who tried to shoot Trump, the first guy, Crooks, is that his phone was immediately turned over to Cellebrite, which I believe is an Israeli firm, an Israeli, sort of data firm. So we know that the Israelis have been involved in all kinds of strange hacking behavior. And so we should be sort of asking this larger question of why is it that when we have these kind of events, we use technology that isn't necessarily that secure, that is maybe backed in different ways. Now, I don't. The police are sort of keeping mum about, and ATF is kind of keeping mum about kind of precisely how they discovered this whole situation. But yeah, it is interesting that we have this guy who's living in Melbourne, Florida, who had previously supposedly lived in the Pacific Palisades. And I should say to you, like, I'm very familiar with this part of California, the Pacific Palisades. I was, in fact, looking at buying a house in that actually burned down during during these fires. So in November, December of last year, I was looking at buying a place on the Pacific Palisades, and literally the house, pretty much every house on that block burned down. So it's a kind of interesting situation. I don't believe, for what it's worth, that this guy was the only person lighting fires, and I think that it does have a kind of flavor to it of something that has been sort of brushed under the rug. But it is interesting that we're seeing a discussion about arson. And, there should be this question here of, is this guy, like some of the other players we've seen in Europe, somebody that was radicalized online and encouraged to commit these acts? And in the Tyler Robinson case, there's sort of this question here about, did Tyler Robinson's lover get money for Tyler Robinson having killed Charlie Kirk? Will that be fully investigated? Who were all the people with the strange license plates coming and visiting their home in Utah together? What was going on in those Discord chats? Those kind of things I think are extremely useful to kind of think through. Now, I don't know if anyone else wants to come up and speak or has anything they want to add. The chats are open. I'm happy to kind of weigh in on some of the other issues. If anyone else has things I've written in the past they're curious about, let me see here. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to think about with the Jonathan Ryder Linda connect, I don't know. Um, the thing to think about his sort of situation is, there was a novel that I encourage a lot of people to read, a science fiction novel, which was really a roman à clef that was done by Eric Frank Russell, who was a part of the Operations Special Executive, or Special Operations Executive, SOE is what they were called, which was a group of British and British aligned players in World War II that would go around lighting Europe ablaze. That was kind of their operation, what they were engaged in, and they were involved in a lot of arson. And there's this book, The Wasp, is effectively about Eric Frank Russell's involvement there in that whole operation. And I strongly encourage people to read that. It's a science fiction setting. It's really, he talks about all these purple aliens, but it's really about his own experiences being a kind of partisan behind enemy lines. And it makes you wonder, we're in a moment now where people are gunning down healthcare executives. We're in a moment where people are really changing the course of things um, by the violent actions that they take. And this sort of main character energy that Gen Z has of sort of going and solving these problems or going and reducing problems that they feel is bedeviling them. That's, I think, something that's going to be very interesting to watch. I think to a large extent, millennials kind of wanted to kind of assimilate in different ways into kind of like corporatist culture. But Gen Z shows no real signs of doing that. And the question of course of youth unemployment, the question of where all this is going, I think these are very open questions, and I think there's something that we need to sort of take seriously over the next bit. I wanted to say, people are asking me about the Pritzker stuff. In general, I am not a big fan of the Pritzker family. We were chatting. The producer and I were chatting earlier about who I thought was likely to be the Democratic nominee, and I don't believe it's going to be Gavin Newsom. I don't believe it's going to be Pritzker, J.B. Pritzker. There's a lot of reasons for this. I think one thing I can do is I can tell you who it's not going to be, and as many people know in this space, I correctly predicted about a month out. Tim Walz is the vice president and about a vice presidential candidate, and JD Vance is the vice presidential candidate about 3 weeks out. And so I can tell you going into 2028 that whoever the candidate is they're going to be heavily anointed by the black world and by the black deep state world in particular, because South Carolina is going to loom large, and I think it's not going to be. I don't think it, as Israel is going and Gaza is going, I don't think it's going to be a Jew. I'm sorry to say. So that rules out Josh Shapiro, who wore the IDF uniform, for 5 months or whatever when he was like doing God knows what in Israel. I don't think it's going to be a woman. I think the Democrats have sort of learned the lesson there of not running women in. The Democrats need white males to be a credible political force in the world. And so I don't think it's going to be a woman. And so if you go through the list of candidates, there are really not that many on the Democratic side who it could credibly be going into 2028. We're sort of in this kind of weird moment where it's not clear who the leadership of the Democratic Party is going to be. And I think this creates all kinds of interesting outcomes that are possible, where we could get people who are podcasters, people who are celebrities. We could get somebody who does a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party in much the same way that Trump did a hostile takeover of the Republican. But welcome, Murat.
What's up, Charles? How you doing?
Doing all right. We're just sort of going through the news of the day. I'm saying anyone has any questions they want to ask me, happy to go through them. And I think, one thing I really want to kind of stress here is I think that what's happening with Trump is that Trump is cleaning up a lot of these cities, not by virtue of the action that he's taken, but the sort of response to it. So I think what's happening is a lot of illegal aliens are seeing these like kind of crazy raids, and they are electing not to come to the United States. And so it's having that kind of effect. But I think the real question here is, what do you do with all the people who've made money over, the slumlords of the world? And I don't think we're ever really going to see a change when we have a world in which Jared Kushner, and Steve Miller's family have made all this money, effectively being slumlords. So that's sort of my just sort of generalized take on it. Um, but yeah, I'm kind of curious what you're seeing out there, Murat.
I mean, you mean in terms of the ice raids and stuff?
Yes, in terms of the ice raids.
I'm not, I'm not like a true believer or a plan truster when it comes to the deportations. I think that there's a little bit of like pomp and circumstance going on with the visuals and kind of how it's set up, to appear. I don't think they're making real dents in the numbers in terms of like a real world change for how illegal immigration affects this country or affects people and affects businesses. So I do think that they're probably deporting like more people than Kamala would have, and I think that there's going to be a lot of people gone that otherwise wouldn't have been. But in terms of like, okay, we've taken care of this problem, I don't know if the resources or the manpower is there to do that. I mean, like, what are your like? How big do you think is the number of illegals in the country? Is it 40 million? Like, do you trust the number, or do you think that's a high estimate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know the number. I'm sort of more interested, like the guy who's picking fruit or picking lettuce or whatever is probably like not my enemy, right? Just like the guy who's like washing the dishes at the restaurant I eat at, probably not my enemy. I am curious about like the effect of this on housing prices, right? And the effect
Sure.
of it on things like school overcrowding. I am curious about like, will we be able to measure, you know, these raids and their effect on things in the community? And I think that that's kind of an open question at the moment. Um, I believe that what we're seeing with these ICE raids is a kind of desire to do a kind of post 9/11 kind of thing where they were targeting all the Arabs. I think the desire is to have a kind of domestic war on terror, targeting all of like the so-called cartels, the so-called gang members. And we should be mindful that the reason so many people came to, the United States from Cuba, from Venezuela, was because Kushner and others pushed for sanctions on Venezuela. And those places became so desperate, there was really nowhere for them to go but come to the United States. And so I think we should be kind of mindful of that. There's a kind of amnesia about why is it that all these people are here? What was done in their
Right.
countries.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I'm not sure why why a lot of people are excited for the prospect of war when that would just increase migration. Like, yeah,
Well,
I
I,
agree
I
with you
think,
that there is definitely like a lot of amnesia about like how these people got here or why.
yeah, I mean, I think that that's actually the purpose of the war. So my view generally is that there's a lot of players that want to drive up the cost of oil. And, if you look at where a barrel of oil is today, right, it's historically pretty low. And so I think that what you see a lot of the time is that, if you create these conflicts, you drive up the price of oil. And what I think, Venezuela is like one of the largest oil reserves in the world. And in many respects, Venezuela supplies something like 80% of Venezuela oil goes to China. So the United States doesn't really have a Venezuela problem. It has China has a need for oil from Venezuela. And so I think, we're at this moment where, the U.S. is producing a record high amount of oil, something like 13.6 million barrels of oil a day. Uh, yeah, and we just don't have to care as much about the rest of the world when it comes to these approaches. And so I think what we're seeing is a kind of oil glut, which is driving down the price of oil. And so you need a number of these countries to get higher oil prices. And so you're causing a lot of efforts to get a conflict going, get a war going. And let's not forget, we have a we have a Secretary of State who wants to be president in the future, and the Secretary of State is backed by a number of players that need cheap labor, that need kind of slave labor in Florida. And from his calculation, if we have all these conflicts in Venezuela, those people are going to go probably to Florida, and that's going to have an effect on the real estate markets, right? People who own housing there are going to benefit from that. And of course, it's going to have an effect as well on things like, basically the labor supply. Lots of people work for cash in Florida. This isn't a surprise to anyone. And so I think that story is not really being told in a serious way. And so I don't really see a need of going to war in Venezuela. There's really no way for Venezuela to invade Guyana. Guyana has a lot of oil. I mean, there's lots of different oil producers in the world. And so we're in this kind of interesting moment where the Chinese are building new electric cars. There are various electric cars that are being produced around the world, some starting in the U.S. as well. And so we're in this moment where, we really don't have to worry as much. And so there's lots of people who want a higher price. And I think that explains a lot of it, right away. And if the U.S. were able to broker a peace deal in Israel or in Ukraine, that would have an extremely positive effect on the price of oil as well. And so we're in a kind of, from the U.S. perspective, that would be a great thing because, again, people could buy all this Russian oil, and that would have a very tremendously interesting effect. So, yeah, it's a curious kind of detail.
Well, how much higher can oil go? I mean, it's already pretty high, right? Like, so just, I mean, when you say drive up higher, do you think they want it even higher than it currently is, or do you mean
No,
they just want to keep it
oil
high?
right now is historically pretty low. I mean, oil is at like 62 dollars a barrel. It's pretty low, all things considered. So, there's a lot of players that want it to go higher still. And by the way, that would drop like easy $10 if the Ukraine war were to end. And OPEC is worried about an oil glut. I mean, you can kind of really go through all these different countries, and what I think is happening is Saudi Arabia and its close relationship with Donald Trump. They want a really, really, really cheap oil world, and there's a lot of players in the region and elsewhere that want the price higher. And of course, when you have sanctions, you create black markets in oil. That's a very common thing that you see. So I think there's that element as well. When you sanction a country, it's not like all the oil that's in Venezuela is just like being legally transported. That's just not really the case.
So what about the narco state of Venezuela? Is that just a red herring?
I don't know. When people talk about this like drug narco state thing, it's like, yeah, like Latin America has lots of drugs in it. Like, what are you gonna do about it? Like the cartels are very like they're very invested in the economy. And by the way, they buy a lot of things here in the United States. They're involved with a lot of things in America too. So this idea that you can just go and topple these countries. I mean, it's so endemic in the society there that it's very hard to root out. And it exists because, the US has lots of dollars and the Latin Americans want to have those dollars. What are some of the best ways to get those dollars? Well, the cheapest, most effective way to do that is to sell drugs. It's like a great return on the amount of labor, the amount of work that goes into it. You think about like a kilo of cocaine. It's a pretty great way of making a buck. Now, the problem, of course, is a lot of this is cut with fentanyl, which has its own problems. But yeah, I mean, we're in an environment in which people think the solution to all this stuff is like a military solution, and it's not. It's an investigative intelligence, seizing of bank accounts, freezing of assets approach. That's kind of the correct approach to these questions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the demand, like, I know the demand for drugs is always going to be up here. But I'm hearing a lot of talk about the transition that Venezuela's economy has made into becoming just a narco state due to the fact that they're sanctioned as sanction up the ass. But
Well, if you
yeah, I
sanction
mean,
a country, right? So if you sanction an oil-producing country, you end up doing a favor for whom? For the Chinese, right? Because China will buy that oil. And that's in effect what Jared Kushner did during the waning days of the first Trump administration. Is he sanctioned Venezuela? There's this giant, oil situation where all of the oil that's going to China, the Chinese now buy it much cheaper because it's black market oil. So that's kind of where we are right now. And that ultimately led to Venezuela and China becoming a lot closer as allies. And so, China has interest in the Western Hemisphere because of the resource question. But even China's economy is itself not doing well, and China is transitioning to a world of electric cars, electric vehicles, electrification. So there's a sort of lingering question of like how can Venezuela, which I believe has something like 40 million people, how can Venezuela really like build itself into a modern society? And the answer is if oil prices are low, or low relatively speaking, they really can't. They're really kind of stuck. This is not Norway we're talking about. Now I want to see if there's anyone else who has anything they want to ask, questions related. I see some people I have known for a while. I see some new faces. We're going to be doing a lot more of these spaces. I'm probably going to be doing a more serious podcast up on Substack and elsewhere. Um, I'm curious, how people are finding things. Yeah, go ahead, Esoteric Kirkism. By the way, Esoteric
Hey,
Kirkism is reading my novel right now, which I'm very happy. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I'm enjoying it a lot. Yeah, I had a tangential.
Say again. I didn't hear you. You cut out. Can anyone hear him? Slight technical difficulties, I think. Hold on one sec. Yeah, I think we'll see how things progress. Let me invite Esoteric back up. We'll see. Anyone else have anything they want to add? Any other thoughts? I think the big question I'm going to be having over the next few months or so is there going to be a lot more political violence? Is there going to be a lot more like mass terrorism, mass casualty events? Are we going to see more things like these fires in California? How should we really think about, the moment that we're in? And I think, on my lawsuit stuff, I'm pretty much of the view that things are moving in the right direction. On the government shutdown side of things, I think you know, we're going to effectively come to some kind of resolution. My question, of course, is what ends up happening when Mamdan, or what is his name, Zoran Mamdani, wins by 20 points in New York. How is that going to be received in New York? What's going to be the kind of big story there? I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to see develop. So I've been sort of thinking about that. But yeah, I mean, I think things are moving in the right direction on a number of fronts. I'm very encouraged to see what's been going on with young Mr. Fuentes as kind of replacing Kirk on the young right person right. I'm very interested to see. It seems to me like Ben Shapiro has all but disappeared. Even Candace, I think Candace is effectively, she's got one of the more powerful shows, or at least one of the most viewed shows. But I have my kind of doubts about Candace's staying power. I think she's probably going to be severely curtailed, severely limited by the Claire Locke lawsuit. But maybe not. Maybe she'll figure out a way around that one. It is a little weird to me that a black American woman who's married to like a strange British guy who's like allegedly gay. It is weird to me how obsessive she seems to be with Macron and all of that. I find that stuff very, very disturbing and weird and kind of creepy. And I do somewhat wonder, is Candace deliberately saying a lot of crazy things in order to make criticism of the Israelis kind of verboten? Or is she just kind of just generally nuts? That's the sort of thing that I think really needs to be sort of thought through in a more serious way. And so I do think that she was very effective at humiliating the Zionists on the 2-year anniversary of October 7th, and that she sort of waited to release the chats that she had of Kirk, 72 hours or 48 hours beforehand. That showed a level of patience and attention to detail that I think was very clever in her way, and certainly something that deserves a lot of credit. And so I think she's maybe a fellow traveler in that way with me on these questions. I'm curious, kind of what else you guys think on Candace. But yeah, go ahead, Big White. Can anyone hear him, Big White? I can't hear you. Murat, can you hear him?
No, I can't. I can't hear him either.
Interesting. All right. Let's give it. Go ahead, Big White. Anything you're looking at, Murat?
No, I apologize. I'm listening in from work, so I'm just gonna drop down. Thanks for having me up, Charles.
No problem. I think we may call it a day unless I can get Esoteric up again. I don't know what's going on there, but let me see here. Let's see if I've got any other messages coming in. Oh my God, the bots here are crazier than when I left this platform like 6 months ago. Yeah, go ahead, Esoteric.
Can you hear me now?
I can. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on the subject of oil, I was going to ask if you think there's the possibility of the Qatar, Turkey, Europe pipeline being established, and if that maybe plays into why a lot of Israelis seem to have a problem with Al Jilani, which I've noticed, and that you'd have a strength in Europe that's not as dependent on foreign oil, something to that effect.
I think a lot of the fear of Jelani is that he's a Turkish asset, and the Israelis are spooked by the Turks, who are members of NATO, who have a really, really large military presence. And I think in general, there was a lot more secret deals being cut between Assad's regime and the Israelis, particularly when it came to like drugs and secret oil. Oil being brought over on the port of Haifa from Kurdistan. And so, yeah, I think that created a lot of pressure. And Jelani is much more pliant, much more helpful. I think in general, the Netanyahu regime just is getting increasingly isolated. It's a kind of North Korea-like state where it's hacking people, it's threatening people. It just doesn't really have a lot of cards to play. What I'm surprised by is the president of the United States doesn't seem to also tell them to just stuff it. And I think that's probably because Trump is of a certain mindset, he's of a certain age, and so on. But yeah, I think you raise an interesting question with the pipeline. My sense, for what it's worth, is the kind of route between UAE, Kuwait. You're going to see Turkey basically needs oil to keep its economy afloat, and it's always needed oil, and so it's going to try to figure out ways to get gas, to get oil. And I think we're going to see kind of them push more into the Arab world as a way of doing that. I mean, they're already playing pretty heavily in Iraq. They have all kinds of side deals with Iran, and that's before we even get into this question of them, buying oil from Russia, and ways in which they buy oil over Turkstream. So, and of course, who is the ambassador to Turkey right now, right? I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. Where you've got Tom Barrack, who Michael Wolff said along with Donald Trump, and Jeffrey Epstein was one of the three musketeers. That's a kind of interesting development of having him as ambassador there, because it means that that's kind of where the energy is shifting. Kind of Lebanese American guy who is thought to be a spy or an ally of the UAE, although he beat those charges. So very, very kind of interesting questions there around who got to be ambassador, who didn't, what kind of side deals are being set up. Very, very kind of open question. And you saw that Trump actually forced Netanyahu to apologize, which he's kind of wont to do when it came to Qatar being attacked by the Israelis. And of course, they weren't able to kill any of the people that they were targeting, which raises the question of whether or not they were trying to kill them in the first place or just spook them into giving them more money.
Interesting. Thanks. And yeah, I'm enjoying the book.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Anyone else want to have anything they want to come up and say? I'm going to probably shut the space down in like 15 minutes or so. In general, what I would say is going to be recording these spaces. People are interested in joining in on kind of the efforts we're doing. I am very serious about getting more involved politically. I see Tomer's there. Hold on, we'll let Tomer up. Go ahead, Tomer. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Charles. I'm glad you're back to Spaces. We missed you over the past several months. And if you like, I can edit your novel, but I'd like to be the last one to edit it. And when we talked last time, or maybe a couple of times before last time, I was working on strategic democracy. And I'm sorry, I'm not feeling very well, so that's why I don't sound well. And I was studying the presidents since Carter till Biden. I'm almost done with it. If you can text me or email or something, I will send it to you.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to see it. I'll message you in the DMs.
Thanks. And the other thing is, I've been collecting data about deception. I call it 44 plus 4. It's part of another book I'm writing. It's called CARTS, Knowledge and Action for Results Over Time in Society. And it's about 10 pages. I'd like you to read it because I think your input will be very valuable. So I'll send you that also.
Yeah, no problem at all. I hope you feel better. Are
Thank
you? Yeah, you're still down in Southern California, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be back. I'll be back in Southern California in a few weeks' time, and maybe we should meet up when I go to
Pleasure.
my family stuff in San Diego. So yeah,
Be my pleasure. I'll take you to lunch.
of course. Well, thank you. I appreciate you. You thinking of me, and I hope you start to feel better. It's how are things in San Diego now? Is it like I hear that things are a bit more chaotic there? Is that true, or what's your impression?
A little bit. I mean, you can see, like I worked in downtown for a long time, about 10 years. And right now, when I go to downtown, I see a lot of people walking around. About 10, 15 years ago, that problem wasn't there. The CDC, it's not the CDC, Center Corporation something, cleaned up downtown after 1983, and downtown became a very good place and started prospering. And then a few years ago, we had hepatitis B rampant in downtown. I haven't been there for a while.
Yeah, I used to when I was in college. I used to go to the gas lamp district, and I used to.
Yes.
go to that. What is the name of that mall down there? That's an open air mall, Horton's Plaza or whatever it is.
Horton Plaza,
Yeah,
and Gaslight 4th and 5th and 3rd Street. Yeah, I used to go there too.
I used to deal with a lot of. So for those who don't know, my grandfather was a rear admiral in the Navy, and he was stationed in Coronado, and my grandmother lived there, and my father and various family members lived there, and so I've spent a lot of time in San Diego and in Coronado in particular, and San Diego is also where like the Mormon world and the Navy world intersect, um, as well as like the Mexican world and the cartels, and there's like all kinds of crazy stuff that goes on in San Diego, but it's all kind of like very sleepy. People don't really think much about San Diego. It's a kind of island. It's got Pendleton to the north, the Pacific Ocean to the west, the desert to the east, and Mexico to the south. And yet it's got, several million people living there. And so it's, to my mind, it's one of the most beautiful places in the country, but it's the kind of place, well, maybe when my novel sells a lot, I'll move back there and spend time there. And, uh, it's, when I'm in San Diego, I park my car and I just ride my bike everywhere in Coronado and hang out, and it's really lovely. It's a place where people of all ages go to retire in the San Diego suburbs there for sure.
Yeah, I have the same thing about San Diego also. We ride bicycles all the time, but off road though, drivers are crazy here. So,
For sure, for sure. Um, well, if anyone else wants to come up and say anything, now's your chance. I'm going to give you like another five minutes or so, and then otherwise, if you have any questions or whatever, if you're shy and want to message me privately, happy to hear from you, and hope to continue this in the near future. Um, yeah, I'm looking forward to maybe speaking a bit more on a few more topics. I think the big question I have lately is where is where is it going to go in the Middle East? My sense is that the Israelis will probably torpedo the deal. My sense is that it will happen pretty quickly, and that will be sort of that. But maybe I could be too pessimistic. Maybe that's sort of how I should think about this. In any event, I hope you guys all have a pretty good day, and we'll do this again soon. Thanks for listening to me, and we'll get going in the near term. And there was another one of these spaces earlier. If you're curious, I sort of go into some of those points as well. So happy to hear from everyone, and take care.